The broadcast did not begin with the triumphant, orchestral swell that usually accompanied royal announcements. There were no flashing news chimes, no brightly lit television studios in central London, and no smooth, media-trained presenters offering practiced smiles. Instead, millions of screens across the United Kingdom flickered to life in a stark, unsettling quietness. The visual frame captured a cavernous, hauntingly silent room that anyone familiar with aristocratic history would recognize instantly. The legendary library of Althorp House. It was a crisp Tuesday morning. Outside, the vast, manicured lawns of the 13,000-acre estate lay frozen under a layer of early frost, but inside the library, the atmosphere felt even colder. Pale, sharp morning light filtered through the towering mullioned windows, cutting through the shadows to illuminate slow-dancing motes of dust suspended in the stagnant air. The scale of the room was oppressive. Behind the heavy oak desk that sat anchored in the center of the frame, walls lined with thousands of leather-bound first editions stretched upward toward a soaring, ornately plastered ceiling. Flanking the massive bookshelves were dark Renaissance portraits worth tens of millions of pounds, faces of ancestors who had built an ancestral fortress of privilege far older and, in many ways, prouder than the Windsor bloodline itself. Sitting rigidly behind that desk was Charles, the 9th Earl Spencer. Opposite him, just out of the camera's view, stood a single cameraman and a veteran independent producer. There were no royal commentators to soften the blow. There was no teleprompter guiding his eyes. The silence in the room was so profound, so absolute, that it felt like a physical entity, pressing heavily against the chests of every single viewer watching from their living rooms, commuter trains, and offices across the nation. Charles sat perfectly still, clad in an impeccably tailored dark suit that seemed to swallow the light. As the fiercely protective brother of the late Princess of Wales, and the uncle to William and Harry, he had spent nearly 3 decades acting as the silent, grieving guardian of his family's deepest traumas. He had lived under the heavy, unyielding weight of an institutional gag order, vowing to shield his nephews from the ruthless, soul-crushing machinery of the palace. For 26 years, he had carried her final, desperate prophecies in absolute secrecy. But last night, behind closed doors, a catastrophic, irreversible fracture had violently forced his hand. Placed deliberately in the dead center of the desk was a small, faded mahogany box. Its brass hinges were visibly tarnished, turned greenish-black with age. To the millions watching, the box looked ordinary, but the way Charles stared at it suggested it contained something volatile. "For 26 years, the world has spoken for my sister," Charles began. His voice was gravelly, carrying the unmistakable, crushing weight of decades of buried grief. Yet beneath the sorrow, there was a steely, terrifying resolve that sent a shiver through the broadcast. Biographers have spoken for her. The palace has spoken for her. The press has spoken for her. He leaned forward, the sudden movement causing the producer behind the camera to catch his breath. Charles's trembling fingers reached out, gently brushing the polished, aged wood of the ancient box. "Today, I am speaking for her." The narrative that the public had been fed for a quarter of a century was about to dissolve. The world had been trained to believe that Diana's final days were a sun-drenched romance, a tragic accident born of chaotic paparazzi chases in a Paris tunnel. But Charles's eyes, locking onto the camera lens with burning intensity, signaled a different, far darker truth. He unclasped the brass linka's hatch, and in doing so, Charles continued, his knuckles turning white against the dark mahogany. "I am breaking a sacred promise, a promise I made to her just 4 days before she died." He opened the lid. The creak of the ancient wood was loud in the dead quiet of the library. Inside the box lay a single, thick blue envelope. It bore no official royal crest, nor did it carry the elegant, embossed letterhead of Kensington Palace. It was a private artifact, sealed with a heavy, jagged dollop of crimson wax. Stamped into the center of that hardened red pool was a crude, unmistakable image, a swallow captured in mid-flight. To any outsider, the bird was just a decorative stamp. But to those who knew the deeply buried history of the Spencer family, that swallow was a ghost. It was the exact secret symbol Diana and Charles had used when they were children. It was a private code stamped on frantic, handwritten notes she would hide under the loose floorboards of the nursery to comfort her younger brother after their mother had abandoned them. The swallow meant only one thing between the siblings: absolute, unfiltered truth. "I was explicitly instructed," Charles said, his voice dropping an octave, pulling the audience into a suffocating intimacy, "never to open this envelope, not unless a very specific, devastating tragedy struck the heart of our family. a tragedy she saw coming with terrifying clarity in the summer of '97. He picked up the heavy blue envelope. The paper was slightly yellowed at the edges, heavy with the burden of time. Yesterday evening, behind closed doors, that tragedy finally came to pass. He did not elaborate on the details of what had occurred the previous night. He did not mention his nephews by name. Instead, he let the brutal, suffocating weight of the mystery hang in the air. The producer adjusted the audio levels, his own hands shaking as he realized they were transmitting an unauthorized, heavily encrypted satellite feed directly to public networks. It was professional suicide, a treasonous act of broadcasting that the Palace Communications Office was, at that very second, frantically trying to jam. But they couldn't touch the signal. They were live to over 20 million people. Charles reached into his breast pocket and drew a silver letter opener. He slid the blade carefully beneath the flap. With a sharp, visceral crack that echoed through the library like a gunshot, the 26-year-old wax seal snapped in two. Charles unfolded the thick, cream-colored parchment. His eyes scanned the first handwritten line, and in an instant, every single ounce of color completely drained from his face. The fragile, younger brother, hiding beneath the Earl's aristocratic armor, was suddenly laid bare, entirely unprotected, as the phantom voice of his sister echoed from the grave. The silence that followed the snapping of the wax seal was heavier than the centuries of aristocratic history, anchoring the walls of Althorp House. Charles stared at the cream-colored parchment, his breathing shallow, his jaw tightening into a hard, rigid line. The looping cursive script, rushed and violently pressed into the paper, was instantly recognizable. It was not the elegant, measured handwriting Diana used for official royal correspondences or charity thank-you notes. This was the frantic, desperate script of a woman writing for her life in the dead of night, knowing the clock was ticking against her. Behind the lens, the veteran producer wiped a bead of cold sweat from his forehead. The monitor showed the satellite transmission stability holding, but the panic from the outside world was already bleeding into their isolated space. The palace was throwing everything they had at the network infrastructure, attempting a digital blackout, but the independent encryption was unbreakable. "My lord," the producer whispered, his voice trembling as he broke the journalistic protocol of silence. "The feed is holding. We are live to 23 million people and counting. Are you absolutely certain you want to proceed with reading these words?" Charles did not look up immediately. For a fleeting, agonizing moment, his mind drifted away from the grand library. In the cinematic theater of his memory, he was no longer a grieving earl in a tailored suit. He was 7 years old again, hiding under the sweeping, dark mahogany staircase of Althorp, his small hands clutching a tiny piece of folded paper. A young Diana, merely 12, knelt beside him in the dim, dusty light, pressing a stolen wax seal into the shape of a swallow to comfort him. "They will always try to tell you what to feel, Charlie." Her phantom voice seemed to whisper through the cold corridors of his mind, her blue eyes bright with a frightening defiance. "But the swallow flies where it wants. It only answers to the truth." Charles cleared his throat, the sound sharp and jarring in the quiet room. "I am certain," he replied, his voice breaking the stillness like shattered glass. He gripped the edges of the letter, his knuckles turning stark white against the yellowed parchment. "Because if I do not read this today, the crown will finish what it started in Paris, and William and Harry will never speak to each other again." The camera zoomed in seamlessly, capturing the microscopic tremble of the paper in his hands. Every viewer across the United Kingdom was holding their breath, locked into a collective state of shock. She wrote this on August 27, 1997, Charles stated, dragging the audience violently back to the reality of the timeline. Exactly 4 days before the crash in Paris, the world has been conditioned to believe her final days were spent in a sun-drenched haze of romance on the Mediterranean. That is the comfortable, sanitized illusion the institution sold you to distract from her reality. The reality is that my sister was absolutely terrified. She was not afraid of the paparazzi chasing her car, nor was she afraid of losing her royal title. Then of what? Lord Spencer, the producer prompted, completely abandoning his professional neutrality, pulled into the gravity of the unfolding historical moment. Of the slow, calculated poison they were already dripping into William and Harry's ears, Charles replied, his gaze locked onto the ink. As he read the next line silently, his memory flashed back to the suffocating confines of Kensington Palace during that final summer. He remembered the peculiar, heartbreaking way Diana had watched her boys play on the lawn, noting how the palace staff would subtly, methodically redirect their games to ensure the heir won while the spare watched. It was a desperate, terrifying preview of the emotional isolation she knew was coming for her youngest son. She explicitly commanded me to keep this buried, Charles continued, his voice dropping into a dangerous, gravelly rumble. She wrote, "Do not bring this to the light unless my boys turn their backs on one another. If they forget they share the same blood, read them this. For decades, I watched the rift grow. I watched the royal machine slowly, methodically isolate the heir and alienate the spare. I stayed silent, hoping they would heal, hoping the bond they forged in the grief of her passing would be enough to save them." Charles choked, swallowing a jagged, painful breath as a tear threatened to spill over his lower eyelid. He forced it back, replacing the sorrow with an intense, aristocratic defiance. But last night, a line was crossed that cannot be uncrossed. A secret was weaponized behind closed doors. A secret only the crown could have provided, designed to turn brother lethally against brother. She didn't just predict their rift, she knew the exact anatomy of the betrayal. He turned the parchment toward the camera for a fleeting second, allowing the lens to capture the chaotic, heavily underlined words at the bottom of the page, where the pen had nearly torn through the heavy paper. "She named the exact person inside the palace who would orchestrate it," Charles whispered, the silence of the library ringing in the aftermath of his words. "And the name she wrote is not who anyone thinks it is." The heavy, suffocating atmosphere inside the Althorp library seemed to hum with the oppressive weight of the Spencer family's ancestral wealth and untouchable status. Behind Charles, the sprawling shelves lined with thousands of leather-bound first editions stretched toward the soaring, ornately plastered ceiling, flanked by Renaissance portraits worth tens of millions of pounds. Althorp House was a 13,000-acre fortress of aristocratic privilege, far older and, in many ways, prouder than the Windsor bloodline itself. Yet, despite the vast fortune and sprawling acres that insulated him, Charles looked entirely unprotected, stripped down to the fragile, frightened younger brother he had once been. The veteran producer, an independent operative Charles had hired specifically to bypass the ironclad royal press embargoes, leaned over the camera monitor, his brow glistening with a cold sweat. He knew that transmitting this unauthorized, encrypted satellite feed directly to public networks was professional suicide. The sheer treasonous magnitude of what they were broadcasting threatened to shatter the very foundation of the modern monarchy. Yet, he could not look away. "My lord," the producer whispered, his voice trembling slightly in the cavernous room, breaking his own professional vow of silence. "The encrypted feed is holding. The palace communications office is frantically trying to cut our signal, throwing everything they have at our network infrastructure, but they cannot touch us. We are live to 26 million people. Are you absolutely certain you want to read those words?" Charles slowly lowered the yellowed parchment, his jaw tightening as a fleeting shadow crossed his features. In the cinematic theater of his memory, he was no longer sitting in a grand library on a crisp Tuesday morning. He was 7 years old again, huddling under the massive, sweeping mahogany staircase of Althorp, his small hands clutching a tiny piece of folded paper. A young Diana, merely 12, knelt beside him in the dim, dusty light, pressing a stolen wax seal into the shape of a swallow to comfort him after their mother had abandoned them. "They will always try to tell you what to feel, Charlie," her phantom voice whispered through the lonely corridors of his mind, her wide blue eyes bright with an almost frightening defiance. "But the swallow flies where it wants. It only answers to the truth." "I am certain," Charles finally replied, his voice breaking the heavy silence like shattered glass. He gripped the edges of the letter, his knuckles turning stark white against the parchment. "Because if I do not read this today, the crown will finish what it started in Paris, and William and Harry will never speak to each other again." The camera zoomed in seamlessly, capturing the microscopic tremble of the aged paper in Charles's hands. Behind the lens, the producer held his breath, acutely aware that 26 million people across the nation were doing exactly the same. Charles looked down at the familiar looping cursive that had once filled his childhood with warmth. This script was hurried, frantic, and violently pressed into the paper, a physical testament to his sister's profound despair. The memory crashed over him with devastating force, plunging him back to late August, 1997, in the suffocating confines of Kensington Palace. In his mind's eye, Diana was pacing the dimly lit drawing room, the air thick with the cloying scent of her favorite white gardenias, a fragrance she used specifically to mask the sharp, metallic tang of her mounting panic. She had shoved the mahogany box hard into his chest, her fingers icy through his shirt, her wide blue eyes darting toward the heavy velvet curtains as if the palace walls themselves were listening. "They are changing the narrative, Charles." Her phantom voice echoed in his mind, laced with an entirely uncharacteristic tremor. "They are building the invisible cage for my boys, and they are doing it while I am still breathing." She wrote this on August 27th, 1997. Charles stated, his voice dropping an octave, dragging the audience violently back to the present moment, exactly 4 days before the crash in Paris. The world believes her final days were spent in a sun-drenched haze of romance on the Mediterranean. That is the comfortable, sanitized illusion the institution sold you to distract from her reality. The reality is that she was absolutely terrified, not of the paparazzi chasing her car, not of losing her royal title. Then of what? Lord Spencer, the producer prompted, his voice a hoarse whisper, completely abandoning his journalistic neutrality in the face of such raw history. Of the slow, calculated poison they were already dripping into William and Harry's ears, Charles replied, his gaze locked onto the letter. He remembered the peculiar, heartbreaking way Diana had watched the boys play during that final summer, noting how palace staff would subtly, methodically redirect their games to ensure the heir won while the spare watched. It was a desperate, terrifying preview of the emotional isolation she knew was coming for her youngest son. Charles had not understood the true danger of it then. He understood it with agonizing clarity now. She explicitly commanded me to keep this buried, Charles continued. She wrote, "Do not bring this to the light unless my boys turn their backs on one another. If they forget they share the same blood, read them this. For decades, I watched the rift grow. I watched the royal machine slowly, methodically isolate the heir and alienate the spare. I stayed silent, hoping they would heal. But last night, a line was crossed that cannot be uncrossed. A secret was weaponized behind closed doors. A secret only the crown could have provided to turn brother lethally against brother." He turned the parchment toward the camera for a fleeting second. Viewers caught a rapid glimpse of heavily underlined words at the bottom of the page, written with such desperate force the pen had nearly torn the paper. "She didn't just predict their rift," Charles whispered, the silence of the library ringing in the aftermath of his words. "She named the exact person inside the palace who would orchestrate it. And the name she wrote is not who anyone thinks it is." The library felt suddenly, inexplicably colder. Charles looked away from the glaring red light of the camera lens, his weary gaze drifting toward the towering windows overlooking the vast, manicured lawns of Althorp. He was not seeing the frost-kissed grass of the present, though. The cinematic reel of his memory snapped violently back to the winter of 1995. Deep inside the suffocatingly opulent halls of Sandringham, he recalled the rhythmic, terrifyingly precise click-clack of polished Oxford shoes against the ancient marble floors. There was always a man in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, standing just out of focus behind the royal family. A man who possessed no title of royal blood, yet wielded the quiet, terrifying power to dictate the monarch's diary, control the press scrums, and subtly, ruthlessly shape the minds of two young, impressionable boys. Charles remembered watching this faceless courtier hand a young William, a solid gold pocket watch, an heirloom meant for kings, while explicitly instructing the staff to give Harry a simple, albeit expensive, wooden puzzle. It was the invisible architecture of inequality, built meticulously under the guise of royal protocol. "You see," Charles said softly, pulling the audience violently back into the tense atmosphere of the library, his voice echoing with an agonizing mixture of sorrow and rage. "The public assumes the rift between my nephews was born of jealousy, or of marriages, or of the sheer crushing pressure of the global spotlight. That is the absolute genius of the firm. They convince the world that the fire started by accident, while they stand comfortably in the shadows, holding the matches." The words written by the Princess of Wales did not merely warn of a distant, hypothetical future. They detailed a meticulous, psychological warfare that was already being deployed against her children while they were still sharing a nursery. Charles cleared his throat, a sharp, grating sound in the dead quiet of the Althorp library, and began to read directly from the parchment. His voice trembled with a devastating mixture of profound grief and boiling anger, channeling the absolute terror his sister had felt over 2 decades ago. "She wrote," Charles whispered, his gaze locked onto the faded blue ink. "They will assign them a guardian, Charles, a man who will smile at you and bow low to Her Majesty, but who answers only to the cold, calculating survival of the institution. He will systematically convince William that familial love is a dangerous liability to the throne, and he will convince Harry that he is entirely, fundamentally replaceable." Charles paused, his thumb brushing over a faded, tear-stained smudge on the bottom corner of the paper, a physical, heartbreaking ghost of his sister's deep despair. The audience watching across the nation could feel the air in the room turn completely stagnant. "But that is not the most terrifying part," Charles continued, leaning closer to the microphone, his expression hardening into impenetrable stone. "She did not just warn me about his psychological games. She detailed the exact final maneuver this man would execute when the boys reached adulthood, a master stroke designed to sever their bloodline forever. She wrote down the exact chronological timeline of when he would strike his final, fatal blow against their brotherhood. And God help us all, the structural trigger written in this 26-year-old letter was realized yesterday. The silence, stretching between Charles and the camera lens, was suddenly, violently shattered by the distant, hollow chime of the Althorp estate grandfather clock striking the quarter hour. The producer's breath hitched audibly behind the monitor. Yesterday, the producer stammered, his professional facade finally crumbling under the sheer magnitude of the claim. Lord Spencer, how could she possibly know a specific timeline decades in advance? Charles did not blink. His mind violently pulled him backward to the suffocating darkness of his own study just 12 hours prior. The cinematic reel of his memory painted a vivid, agonizing picture. Midnight rain lashing violently against the towering leaded windows of Althorp, and the sudden, jarring vibration of a secure, encrypted mobile phone he kept locked in his desk drawer. It was a line known to only one other person, an elderly, invisible royal archivist named Margaret. Decades ago, Diana had quietly and personally paid for Margaret's daughter's life-saving heart surgery, buying an unshakable, lifelong loyalty that transcended any oath to the crown. Over the phone, amidst choked, terrified sobs, Margaret had whispered the horrific details of a secret midnight summit convened at Windsor Castle. She had described the charcoal-suited courtier sliding a heavily redacted, centuries-old legal parchment across a mahogany table toward a pale, completely exhausted William. It was the absolute, irrevocable severance of Harry's bloodline from the official royal archives, a devastating legal erasure enacted under the guise of protecting a vulnerable, ailing monarchy. William, isolated, exhausted, and mentally cornered by the courtier's relentless, decades-long psychological warfare, had picked up the pen and signed it. She did not predict a specific day of the week or the weather, Charles answered softly, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that commanded the absolute attention of millions. She predicted the exact structural vulnerability. She knew that the machinery of the palace operates on a rigid, mathematical timeline. She knew that exactly 6 months after the transition of the crown reached its most vulnerable point, this courtier would strike to consolidate absolute control over the heir. Charles picked up the letter again, the cream parchment trembling violently against his tailored cuffs. The pacing of the room shifted from cold dread to a frantic, suffocating urgency. The public was told yesterday that the royal family was simply restructuring its patronages and administrative roles. Charles spat, the words tasting like ash in his mouth, a bureaucratic lie designed for the evening news to keep the masses blind. But the letter in my hands warned of the true protocol. She called it the act of severance. The courtier finally convinced William that his brother was no longer merely a media distraction, but a terminal threat to the survival of the institution itself. He forced William to choose between his mother's ghost and the crushing weight of the crown. The producer gripped the edge of his desk, his knuckles turning stark white. And William signed it? He legally erased his own brother? He did, Charles whispered, a profound sorrow momentarily eclipsing his rage. He remembered Margaret's weeping voice echoing through the encrypted phone lines last night. She told me William didn't even look at the signature line, Charles. He just stared blankly at the wall, completely hollowed out by the machine. But the courtier made one fatal, catastrophic miscalculation. Charles's eyes snapped back to the camera lens with a sudden, terrifying ferocity that seemed to pierce through 27 million screens. He believed that by forcing William to sever the tie, he had finally silenced Diana's lingering influence forever. He did not know that my sister had left an absolute failsafe. Charles flipped the ancient parchment over. The thick, hurried ink bled slightly through the heavy paper, revealing a final, isolated paragraph written at the very bottom of the page. She left one final instruction, Charles breathed, the air in the library suddenly feeling entirely depleted. A weapon she handed directly to me to detonate the very foundation of the palace if this day ever came. And it requires me to reveal what actually happened in the tunnel in Paris. The mere mention of the Paris tunnel caused the heavy atmosphere inside the Althorp library to violently fracture. It was as if an invisible strike of lightning had hit the room, instantly shattering the historical solemnity and replacing it with a raw, electric dread. Charles squeezed his eyes shut for a prolonged, agonizing moment, his head bowing under an invisible weight. The cinematic reel of his mind, brutal and unforgiving, dragged him backward through time, bypassing decades of quiet grieving to deposit him directly into the sterile, blindingly white corridors of the Pitier-Salpêtrière Hospital on August 31st, 1997. Even now, sitting in the safety of his ancestral home, he could still smell the sharp, metallic tang of iodine and ozone that had hung in the air of that Parisian medical ward. He could still feel the numbness in his own limbs as a younger, shell-shocked version of himself walked down those endless corridors to identify his sister's body. But as Charles opened his eyes and looked back into the camera lens, his expression revealed that the most horrifying memory etched into his psyche was not the agonizing, suffocating silence of Diana's hospital room. It was the man he had crossed paths with just outside her door. "As I walked down that hallway," Charles said, his voice dropping to a harsh, gravelly whisper that forced the producer to lean closer to the audio monitor, "I passed a figure standing in the shadows. A man wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, completely out of place amidst the frantic French medical staff. He was quietly, methodically sliding a crushed, clear plastic evidence bag containing Diana's personal effects into a dark leather briefcase. He did not look at me. He did not offer condolences. His face was an absolute, unreadable mask." The library descended into a state of paralysis as Charles connected the dots. For 26 years, I forced myself to believe it was merely the cold, unfeeling machinery of royal protocol. I told myself the palace was simply securing her belongings. But the parchment sitting in my trembling hands right now rewrites that entire night with a sickening, undeniable clarity. The courtier had not been dispatched to Paris to mourn, nor was he there to support a grieving family. He had been deployed as an operative to sanitize the crime scene before the French authorities could fully understand what they were looking at. Behind the monitor, the independent producer felt the air leave his lungs. The live viewer counter on the encrypted feed was surging rapidly, ticking past 28 million people across the nation, all locked in a state of collective, breathless shock. The weight of the accusation was treasonous, threatening to tear down the very fabric of the monarchy in a single morning. The public, Charles continued, his eyes burning with decades of suppressed, agonizing fury, was spoon-fed a carefully constructed narrative, a story of an intoxicated driver, a tragic, high-speed paparazzi chase, and a series of chaotic, unfortunate happenstances in the dark. It was a comfortable illusion, designed to make the world accept her death as a random accident. But my sister was not a victim of chaos. She was a casualty of a schedule. The producer gripped the edge of the mahogany desk, his voice a hoarse, trembling whisper that broke through his journalistic neutrality. "Lord Spencer, are you alleging a targeted, state-sanctioned assassination on live television?" "I am not alleging anything," Charles countered, his voice suddenly sharpening into an unyielding, razor-like edge. "I am reading the sworn testimony of a woman who uncovered the blueprint of her own demise before it ever took place. She wrote these words 4 days before her heart stopped because she had successfully intercepted the courtier's logistical plans. She knew the standard royal security protocols had been intentionally, systematically compromised. She knew her usual route had been deliberately altered by palace operatives operating behind the scenes." He paused, the pacing of his words slowing to a crawl, allowing the devastating reality of the truth to settle over the millions of people watching from their phones, offices, and living rooms. "This letter was her ultimate fail-safe," Charles whispered, a profound sorrow momentarily eclipsing his rage. She knew the psychological grip this courtier held over her children. She knew that if this man ever succeeded in tearing William and Harry apart, the only way to break his influence over the future king would be to expose the monster William had been blindly trusting his entire adult life. William signed that act of severance yesterday, believing he was saving the crown from his brother's rebellion. He has spent his life looking to this man for guidance, entirely unaware that he was taking orders from the very architect of his mother's death. Charles carefully set the cream-colored parchment down on the polished oak desk. The camera zoomed in tightly, capturing the microscopic tremble of his hands as they moved away from the letter and back toward the seemingly empty mahogany box. He did not look at the lens. Instead, his gaze focused entirely on the faded blue velvet lining at the bottom of the ancient chest. Words on a page can easily be dismissed by palace lawyers as the tragic paranoia of a frightened, isolated woman, Charles whispered, a dark, dangerous resolve settling over his aristocratic features. The institution would have spent the next 24 hours convincing the public that Diana was unstable, which is exactly why she did not just leave me a letter. She left me the physical proof. With a sudden, sharp mechanical click that echoed like a gavel striking wood in the deathly quiet library, Charles pressed his thumb hard against a specific, worn corner of the box. The velvet lining folded upward, and a hidden false bottom sprang open, revealing a shallow, lead-lined recess hidden beneath. The mechanical click of the hidden compartment echoed like a gavel striking wood in the deathly quiet of the Althorp library. The velvet lining of the box folded upward, revealing a shallow, lead-lined recess. Charles exhaled a long, shuddering breath. His mind violently snapped back to the humid August night in Kensington Palace, when Diana had shoved the box into his hands. He remembered the bizarre, heavy weight of the small wooden chest. For 26 years, he had assumed the weight was merely the thick wax and heavy parchment of the letter. But last night, when the encrypted call from Windsor confirmed William's catastrophic betrayal of his brother, Charles had finally opened the box in the solitude of his study and discovered the terrifying truth of its gravity. Slowly, deliberately, Charles reached into the concealed compartment. He pulled out two objects. The first was a folded, partially charred sheet of official royal household stationery. The edges were deeply stained with a rust-colored hue that time could never wash away the undeniable, horrifying stain of dried blood. The second object was a heavy, silver security cipher key, the exact kind issued only to the absolute highest tier of palace intelligence officers. For over 2 decades, this courtier has poisoned William's mind with a very specific, calculated lie, Charles said, his voice dropping to a surgical, deadly calm. He told William that his mother was erratic, that she was paranoid, that she deliberately dismissed her own royal protection squad in Paris because she wanted to rebel against the crown. It was a lie designed to make William view his mother's death as an unfortunate consequence of her own instability, making him infinitely easier to mold into a compliant, emotionally detached heir. The producer stared at the bloody parchment, the color completely draining from his face as the sheer treasonous magnitude of the broadcast fully crystallized. "Lord Spencer, what is that document?" "This," Charles replied, unfolding the stiff, stained paper with agonizing care, "is the official classified security manifest for August 31st, 1997. My sister intercepted it from the courtier's private desk just hours before she fled to Paris. It is a direct, undeniable order to strip her of her elite British security detail, leaving her entirely vulnerable to the chaos that followed." Charles held the silver cipher key up to the camera lens. It glinted coldly in the pale morning light. "This cipher key matches the digital signature on the withdrawal order," Charles continued, his eyes burning with tears of absolute, unfiltered rage. "It belongs to the exact same man who stood in Windsor Castle last night and convinced William to legally erase his brother. The man who orchestrated the mother's demise is the exact same man who just successfully executed the assassination of her son's brotherhood." The library descended into an oppressive, suffocating silence. "But I did not just bring this proof to a television camera," Charles whispered, the tension in the room suddenly snapping like a taut wire. "Because 10 minutes before we went live to the nation, I had an exact, authenticated replica of this blood-stained order hand-delivered to the breakfast table at Adelaide Cottage." The producer gasped, stepping back from the monitor. "You sent it directly to Prince William." Charles did not break eye contact with the lens. "Yes. And I know he has just opened it because 30 seconds ago, the encrypted palace switchboard went entirely, inexplicably dead." The revelation hung in the library like a suspended guillotine. Charles's statement that he had bypassed the impenetrable royal security apparatus to deliver a piece of 26-year-old, blood-stained treason directly to the future, King shattered the final remaining boundaries of the broadcast. The producer staggered backward, abandoning the camera monitor, his hands trembling as he realized they weren't just filming a confession, they were broadcasting the real-time collapse of the modern monarchy. Charles leaned back into the heavy leather of his chair. The adrenaline that had fueled his righteous anger suddenly drained away, leaving behind the profound, exhausting ache of a 26-year vigil. His gaze drifted from the camera lens to the ancient leaded windows. He wasn't seeing the morning light. His mind was violently pulling him back to September 1997, to the agonizing march behind his sister's casket. He remembered looking over at a 15-year-old William, his young face, a mask of unspeakable trauma, staring blankly ahead. At that exact moment, the charcoal-suited courtier had stepped out of the shadows, placed a heavy hand on William's shoulder, and whispered, "Do not weep, sir. A king does not break. The crown is your only family now." It was the precise moment the psychological Iron Maiden had snapped shut around the boy. For decades, William had worn that heavy gold pocket watch from Sandringham, entirely unaware it was the very chain tying him to his mother's executioner. The oppressive silence of the Althorp library was suddenly, violently shattered by a sound that made the producer jump out of his skin. It wasn't the encrypted mobile phone in the drawer. It was the heavy, antique rotary phone sitting on the edge of Charles's desk, a direct, unlisted landline known only to his immediate blood relatives. It rang once, twice, The metallic bells echoed like a church knell across the live televised feed to 28 million terrified Britons. Charles stared at the archaic device. His hand shook as he reached across the polished oak, his fingers wrapping around the cold black receiver. He lifted it to his ear. For a long, agonizing moment, there was nothing but the faint, crackling hiss of static over the line. Then came the sound of a ragged, suffocating inhalation of breath. "Uncle Charles." A voice cracked through the receiver. It was not the polished, heavily rehearsed baritone of the Prince of Wales that the public knew. It was the broken, terrified sob of a 15-year-old boy who had just realized his entire life had been manipulated. He was standing right beside me when I opened the envelope. He tried to take the paper from me. Tears freely spilled over Charles's weathered cheeks, soaking into his collar. "Where is he now, William?" Charles whispered, his voice trembling with a ferocious, protective love. "I locked the doors. I've ordered my personal security to detain him," William replied, the shattered boy suddenly hardening into the undeniable, terrifying timbre of a true king seizing his own mind back. "And Uncle Charles, Harry is on a plane. I called him. He is coming home." Charles gently placed the receiver back onto its cradle. The click of the plastic was the final period at the end of a 26-year sentence. He looked slowly back into the camera, his eyes shining with the absolute, triumphant vindication of a brother who had finally completed his life's work. The failsafe had detonated. The swallow had finally flown free. "My sister's final wish is fulfilled," Charles said softly, the profound peace in his voice radiating through millions of screens. "The truth has saved her, boys." The broadcast instantly cut to black, offering no pundit commentary, no outro music, and no carefully worded royal response. Just the devastating, undeniable reality of a mother's love reaching from beyond the grave to destroy her enemies, leaving an entire nation sitting in staggering, absolute silence.